All right, welcome everyone to another deep dive. Today we're going to take a look at recent events in U.S. politics. And specifically, we're going to examine it through the lens of religion.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. And what really sparked this deep dive is a picture we saw of Marco Rubio, who was Secretary of State at the time.
Right.
And he's giving an interview on Fox News talking about, pretty big stuff like Gaza and Ukraine. And he has this very visible Ash Wednesday cross on his forehead.
Yeah, you don't really see that every day, do you?
No, not really. And I mean, it got us thinking, like, what's the meaning behind this? Is there something more to it than just, a religious observance?
Right. I mean, it raises a lot of questions about the intersection of religion and politics.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And to help us unpack all of this, we're going to be turning to the work of Juan Creo.
Okay.
And he has this great YouTube channel called El Diarios. And it's full of insightful analysis. They really dig into the news, offer different interpretations, and always try to approach things with common sense.
Yeah, I've seen some of his videos, really thought-provoking stuff.
Totally. And there's this particular video on his channel that caught our eye. It's called A Cross on the Forehead of the United States. And it features these two journalists, Maria Ramirez and Javier Biosca. They have this awesome podcast where they just break down current events.
Nice. So that's our source material for today.
Exactly. So we'll be looking at excerpts from the transcript of that podcast. And the mission for our deep dive today is to figure out what this seemingly simple gesture by Rubio, this cross on his forehead, could actually signify.
Yeah, we're not just looking at the image itself, but trying to understand it within a larger context, right?
Absolutely, because how does this fit into the whole political strategy, especially with the role of religion in American politics these days?
Right, there's definitely a lot to unpack there.
Okay, so let's just start with that striking image, right? Rubio representing U.S. foreign policy, talking of these international conflicts, with a dark cross on his forehead. I mean, that was pretty surprising to a lot of people. And Maria Ramirez, in the El Diarios video, she brings up a really interesting perspective on Rubio's background, which I think is helpful here.
Okay, yeah, what does she say?
So she talks about how early in his career, Rubio was seen as this very adaptable politician, even willing to, break away from some of his mentors.
Interesting. So not afraid to chart his own course.
Yeah, exactly. And he was also seen as someone who really believed in this idea of American exceptionalism. And he was especially vocal about protecting people fleeing authoritarian regimes.
Makes sense, considering his family's own immigration story.
Right, and that's actually where Maria Ramirez points out a seeming contradiction.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, she notes how Rubio is now espousing views that kind of echo Kremlin talking points.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift.
Yeah, and it's definitely confusing for those who followed his early career.
So how does his religious background play into all of this?
Well, Maria reminds us that Rubio comes from a Catholic background, although he had a brief stint with Mormonism as a child before returning to Catholicism. Gotcha.
And while he does mention God in his speeches, which is, fairly common in U.S. politics, he wasn't really considered an ultra-religious figure before all of this.
Interesting. So it's not like he was known for wearing his faith on his sleeve, so to speak.
Right, exactly. But, Maria also points out that seeing someone with an Ash Wednesday cross on their forehead is actually pretty common in some parts of the U.S.
True, especially in more Catholic areas.
Yeah, so it's like a public display of faith for a lot of people.
Right, so it's almost like a cultural norm in certain places. And that's actually what makes Javier Biosca's analysis even more intriguing, I think.
Oh, okay. How so?
Well, he argues that even though it's a widespread practice, Rubio appearing with that cross in such a specific political and media context can't be seen as just a coincidence.
Yeah, I see what you mean. Like the timing of it all makes you wonder if there's a deeper message there.
Exactly. And Biosca actually goes on to talk about what he calls an uptick in the political use of religion in the Trump administration. Okay, so what does he mean by that specifically? What kind of evidence does he point to?
So Biosca highlights a few recent actions taken by the Trump administration that really showcase this trend.
Okay.
First, he mentions the executive order that created this working group to eradicate anti-Christian bias.
Interesting. The name itself kind of makes you question, is there really widespread bias against Christians in the U.S.?
Right. It's a pretty bold claim when you consider the historical and demographic influence of Christianity in the country.
Yeah, the idea of Christians being an oppressed group in the U.S. seems, a bit off, to say the least.
Definitely. And then on top of that, there's the creation of the White House Faith Office, which is basically a group of advisors focused on policies related to religion.
Okay, so it seems like they're really prioritizing religion in their policy decisions.
Yeah, and Biasca brings up another pretty telling episode.
What's that?
Trump actually boasted at the National Prayer Breakfast about pardoning anti-abortion protesters who were imprisoned for literally praying.
Wow. I mean, that's a pretty clear example of how religion is being used in the political sphere.
Definitely. And to give you an even better sense of the atmosphere at the time, the El Diario's video includes this audio clip from the first meeting of Trump's cabinet. And guess what? It starts with a prayer.
No way, really.
Yeah, and Marco Rubio is right there, present at this religious invocation at the start of a government meeting.
So it seems like religion was really front and center in the Trump administration.
It definitely played a significant role. And here's the key takeaway. Even if Trump himself, and maybe even Rubio, aren't necessarily what you'd call ultra-religious, there are some very influential figures within their circle whose religious fervor is much more intense.
And I'm guessing those beliefs have a direct impact on their political decisions.
Exactly, and their influence can't be ignored.
All right, so let's name names. Who are these ultra-religious figures within Trump's inner circle that El Diario's points to?
So Biasca highlights two main figures. First, there's Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of Defense, and his fascination with the Crusades is well known. He even has tattoos with references to Christian warriors.
Huh, that's interesting. I mean, that kind of imagery can be pretty problematic, especially considering how it's been appropriated by white supremacist groups.
Yeah, it definitely raises some red flags. And Biasca goes on to mention Hegseth's 2020 book titled The American Crusade.
Okay, what's that about?
Well, in the book, Hegseth actually downplays the importance of voting as a tool for change.
Really?
Yeah, he advocates for a more active fight, likening it to the historical Crusades. He even goes so far as to claim that the benefits of Western civilization are a direct legacy of these Christian warriors.
That's a pretty, let's say, selective interpretation of history.
Yeah, it definitely glosses over a lot of, shall we say, less savory aspects of the Crusades.
Right, and the whole idea of a modern-day crusade is just, well, it's pretty unsettling.
Definitely. So that's Hegseth. The other key figure Biasca mentions is Mike Huckabee, who was appointed by Trump as the ambassador to Israel.
Okay, and what's his story?
Well, Biasca describes him as a Christian fundamentalist with a strong fixation on the apocalypse.
So we're talking end times prophecy kind of stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And his religious beliefs really shape his entire political stance on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict.
Okay, so how do these apocalyptic beliefs actually translate into policy positions?
Well, for starters, Huckabee denies the existence of the Israeli occupation.
Wow, okay.
He even questions the very identity of Palestinians and completely rejects the two-state solution.
So he's coming at this from a very specific worldview.
Yeah, and it's rooted in his literal belief in biblical prophecies about the apocalypse. He firmly believes in the imminent second coming of Christ to Israel, and that for this to happen, Jews must have complete control over the land of Israel.
That's a pretty extreme theological viewpoint.
Yeah, and after the second coming, according to his interpretation, the remaining Jews will recognize Jesus as the Messiah and convert to Christianity.
So his entire perspective on the region is informed by this very particular religious framework.
Exactly, and it's important to understand that when trying to make sense of his political positions.
Right, so we've got these two figures, Hegseth and Huckabee, with these very strong religious beliefs that seem to be influencing their approach to policy. But how does all of this connect to the larger MAGA movement and the influence of evangelicals in U.S. politics?
That's where it gets really interesting. Biasca really emphasizes the huge influence of the white evangelical movement within the MAGA movement and the Republican Party as a whole.
Right. It's not just about individual figures, but a whole movement with a lot of power and influence.
Exactly, and experts describe it as a reactionary and populist cultural movement. It goes way beyond just theology. It's about shaping the culture and politics of the country.
So it's not just about religious beliefs, but a whole worldview with political implications.
Precisely. And when we talk about MAGA, we're talking about the ideology and political style associated with Donald Trump, which is often characterized by a strong nationalism, a populism that appeals directly to the base, and a confrontational approach towards elites and the mainstream media.
And this movement has been fiercely loyal to Trump, right?
Absolutely. Polls consistently show that around 80% of white evangelicals have voted for Trump since 2016. And Biasca highlights the existence of this very robust and self-reinforcing support network. It's made up of churches, media outlets, and publishing houses that all promote this specific political and religious viewpoint.
So it's like a closed loop with a massive and very engaged audience.
Yeah, it's a very powerful echo chamber, and this influence is nothing new.
Right, this has been building for a while.
Exactly. So according to Bioska, how has this movement tried to shape the Republican Party platform in recent history?
Okay, good question.
Well, since the 1980s, the white evangelical conservative movement has been working persistently to influence the Republican Party's agenda. Initially, opposition to school segregation was a central issue for some within the movement.
Interesting. So they were involved in the civil rights movement, but on a specific side of it.
Yeah, it's a complex history. But over time, other issues were added to their agenda, like the fight against abortion. And more recently, they've focused on things like immigration, the border wall, gun rights, Black Lives Matter, and debates about gender issues.
It's fascinating how ideas that seemingly don't have a direct religious root, like the concept of the white male protector, can resonate with these more religious and conservative viewpoints.
Right, Bioska points out how this figure of the white male protecting his family can connect with anti-feminist ideas, even if those ideas don't always have an explicit religious origin.
So it's like this idea of masculine strength as a guarantor of family and national security finds fertile ground in certain conservative religious sectors.
Exactly. And the issue of gun ownership also seems very tied to this mentality.
Right, like the idea of being armed to protect your family and your country.
Exactly. And Bioska mentions that the percentage of white evangelicals who own guns in their homes is significantly higher than the average for the U.S. population.
That's pretty telling.
Yeah, it speaks to a certain mindset.
So, circling back to that initial image of Rubio with the cross, it seems like all of these elements we've been discussing are interconnected and could be part of a larger and more deliberate political message.
Absolutely. It's like one piece of a much larger ideological and political puzzle.
Right, and to really grasp the depth of these dynamics, it helps to look at historical parallels and also contemporary geopolitical contexts.
Agreed. So what kind of historical parallels or broader contexts does Javier Bioska offer in his analysis?
Well, he draws this interesting parallel to the doctrine of manifest destiny in U.S. history.
Oh, interesting. The idea that westward expansion was divinely ordained.
Exactly, and that provided a religious justification for territorial expansion in the 19th century. He also points out the similarity to extremist views within Israel regarding the occupation of Palestine.
So views that are now seemingly finding support among figures in the U.S. government, like Ambassador Huckabee.
Right, it's like these patterns of religious justification for political projects of expansion or exclusion are repeating themselves.
Yeah, it's a recurring theme throughout history. And we can't overlook how other world leaders, like Putin in Russia, also use ultra-conservative religious rhetoric to fuel culture wars and justify their actions against the West.
So it's not just an American phenomenon, it's happening globally.
Exactly. And Bioska emphasizes that both Putin and Trump use religion as a tool to consolidate their power and mobilize their base.
It's a very effective strategy, unfortunately.
It really is.
So, based on Bioska's analysis, religion is being used very strategically in politics.
Absolutely. It's being framed as part of this culture war where certain Republicans are accusing Democrats of being worse Christians or of going against traditional religious values.
Right, like the whole war on Christmas rhetoric we hear every year.
Exactly. And Bioska mentions the National Prayer Breakfast as a prime example of this political use of religion, where Trump bragged about pardoning those anti-abortion activists who were jailed for praying.
So they're really playing up this narrative of persecution.
Yeah, and that's where it gets dangerous. Because, as Bioska warns, this rhetoric of a supposedly persecuted Christian majority has some troubling historical precedents.
Right, like when a majority group starts feeling oppressed or persecuted, history shows that it can lead to discrimination or even violence against minorities.
Exactly, and that's a very dangerous dynamic that, according to Bioska, is already playing out to some extent in American society today.
Well, that's a sobering thought. Javier Bioska, thank you so much for your insightful analysis in El Diarios. This is clearly a complex issue with many layers.
Absolutely, and thank you for guiding this conversation. It's been a pleasure.
Hola, si está escuchando esto, suscríbete que lo tienes por aquí. Debajo es completamente gratuito y por supuesto, regálame tu like para que este video llegue a muchas más personas.
To wrap things up, I'll leave you with one final thought. Considering the historical use of religious justifications for political actions and the current trends we've discussed, what do you think the long-term implications might be for the separation of church and state? And how might this influence global politics beyond U.S. borders?
That's a great question, something for all of us to ponder. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.